The boardroom of Druce Holdings occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and on the morning Veda brought the evidence, it looked exactly like what it was. A room built for verdicts. She had been here 1,000 times, had sat in the junior chairs along the wall when she was 12 and her mother let her observe quarterly reviews, had stood at the presentation screen for her first financial analysis at 23, shaking slightly watching Virginia's face for approval that came in the form of a single nod. Had learned every inch of this room the way you learned a room that made the decisions about your life. Today she stood at the head of the table. She had never stood at the head of the table before. The projector lit the wall behind her in clean white light. The spreadsheets were color-coded. The bank transfer records were time-stamped. 6 months of documentation assembled with the kind of precision that came from someone who had grown up watching a CEO operate and understood exactly what standard of proof was required to breach a Druce. She had been thorough. She was always thorough. Virginia sat at the other end of the long glass surface, which was 17 feet of polished silence between them. She wore her usual charcoal suit. Her hair was its usual immaculate silver. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, with the stillness of a woman who had trained herself over decades to reveal nothing through her hands. To Virginia's right sat Royce. Royce was 45, broad through the shoulders, wearing the expression of a man who had shown up for a meeting he already knew the outcome of. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he was holding a coffee cup with both hands, which was the only sign that his hands needed something to do. He did not look at his sister. Veda presented for 11 minutes. She walked through the shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada under Royce's signature. She showed the wire transfers, 8 of them over 14 months, totaling $4,300,000. She displayed the offshore account records she had obtained through a contact at a forensic accounting firm, the numbered account in the Cayman Islands that received the funds and had been dormant until 18 months ago. She showed the sports betting records, the loan payments to 3 separate private lenders, the pattern of transfer amounts that matched the pattern of Royce's losing seasons with a precision that left no statistical room for coincidence. She did not editorialize. She stated facts in the order they occurred. When she finished, the room was quiet. Virginia looked at the presentation screen for a moment. Then she looked at Veda. Not at Royce, not at the screen, at Veda. The look lasted about 4 seconds, which was long enough to be something other than an assessment. "You've been working on this since February," Virginia said. "Since January," Veda said. "I noticed the first anomaly in January." Virginia nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone confirming information they already possessed. "And you brought this here, to a full board presentation, rather than coming to me privately." "I came to you privately in March," Veda said. "You told me the discrepancies were a bookkeeping adjustment related to the Portland acquisition." "I remember. The Portland acquisition closed in November. These transfers began in April of the following year." Virginia looked at Royce. Royce set his coffee cup down. Something moved between them, a look, a communication of some kind, completed in less than a second. It had the quality of something rehearsed, something they had already decided. Veda felt the first shift of understanding in her chest, like the first audible crack in a structure you thought was sound. She had expected anger. She had expected denial or demands for verification, or the cold fury that Virginia deployed when subordinates overstepped. She had expected some version of her mother being blindsided. Virginia was not blindsided. "Veda," Virginia said. Her voice was even, CEO flat, the voice she used for difficult personnel conversations. "What you've presented here is a fabrication. The bank records are A fabrication, Virginia repeated, assembled by someone with access to the company's internal accounting systems and a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate the appearance of records. That someone is you. The room changed temperature. You've been conducting an unauthorized investigation into your brother's finances, Virginia continued. You've been accessing accounts outside the scope of your role. You have hired a third-party forensic firm without board authorization, and you have presented the results of this unauthorized investigation in a full board setting in an attempt to remove Royce from his position. Mom, Veda's voice came out quieter than she intended. The transfers are real. The accounts are real. I didn't create them. I found them. You are hereby terminated from Druce Holdings, Virginia said. The words landed the way certain words landed, cleanly, without resistance, as if the air had decided not to slow them down. Effective today, your access credentials have already been revoked. HR has been notified. Your personal items from your office will be delivered to your apartment by end of business. Veda looked at Royce. Royce was looking at the table, and that was the thing. That was the precise moment when Veda understood. Not just that Royce wasn't surprised, that Royce had known this was coming. That Royce had known this was coming with the certainty of someone who had helped plan it. He had not been caught. He had been protected. Virginia opened a slim leather folder and removed a single envelope. She slid it down the length of the glass table. It stopped 3 feet from Veda's hand. Your grandfather Clement left specific instructions regarding the disposition of his personal assets, Virginia said. The lake property in Coldwater County has been transferred to your name. Consider it your severance. Sign the waiver, take the deed, and do not contact this office again. Mom, Veda said. One more time, because there was always one more time. You are dismissed, Veda. She picked up the envelope. Her hands did not shake. She had her mother's discipline in that at least. The elevator ride down 42 floors took 42 seconds. Veda counted them. She had $420 in her checking account, a phone on the family plan that would be cut off before she reached the street, and an envelope containing the deed to a piece of property she had visited once at age 7, standing in front of something tall and gray and covered in vines holding her grandfather's hand. She remembered asking him what was inside the tower. She remembered how he had looked at her when she asked. Not down, sideways, the way adults looked at children when they said something that surprised them. That's for finding out, he had said. And then he had put something in her pocket, something small and heavy. She had pulled it out later in the back seat of the car on the way home. A compass, brass, old, the needle trembling slightly before settling. She still had it. She had never known why he gave it to her. She had 7 months to figure that out. Because 7 months after that boardroom, after an autumn and a winter, and most of a spring in an apartment that the lease had already run out on, after $420, became $312, and then $108, and then a decision. Veda Druce loaded her car and drove north. The drive from Manhattan to Coldwater County took just under 4 hours in good traffic. She had never made it in good traffic. She arrived in rain. Druce Lake was not a lake anyone had named on purpose. It had acquired the name the way small bodies of water in rural New York acquired names through decades of being called something by the people who lived near it until the name became fact. The property her grandfather had owned sat at the southeastern edge of the lake down a gravel road that had not been maintained by anyone in the last several years and showed every year of it. The cabin came into view around a bend in the road. She stopped the car and looked at it. She had thought about what it might look like. She had allowed for the possibility of significant disrepair. She had told herself in the apartment in the last weeks before she left that she was not going to be precious about physical hardship, that she came from people who built things, that she had learned practical skills at some point in her life that were recoverable, that the body could do more than the city had required of it. None of that preparation covered what she was looking at. The roof sagged in the center like a spine that had given up. The cedar siding had gone past the color of weathering into something that was more texture than color. Gray-black rot that moved in patches across the exterior walls like a slow tide. The front porch had separated from the main structure and leaned outward at an angle that suggested the next significant wind would finish what the last several winters had started. 3 windows were boarded over with plywood that had been there long enough to be growing its own mold colony. The 4th window was missing its glass entirely. The smell reached her when she opened the car door. Wet rot, mildew, the organic sweetness of a building that had been composting itself in slow motion for years. She got out of the car. She stood in the rain and looked at the property, and then she looked past it. Because past the cabin through the tree line that separated the property from the lake, something else was visible. She had glimpsed it on the drive-in and had almost dismissed it as a geographic feature, a rock formation, a natural protrusion of the granite that underlay all of this region. But it was not natural. It was a tower. 65 feet of granite cylinder rising from the edge of the lake, wrapped in decades of vine growth from its base to somewhere near its crown. The vines were thick enough to obscure the stone completely on the lower third. The upper section showed the dark gray of the stone itself, pocked and scarred by the same frost cycles that had been working on this landscape since the glacier retreated. The crown of the tower was partially collapsed, the eastern edge broken and irregular, the remaining stone darkened by water and time. It was enormous. It should not have existed here. It had the scale of something industrial, something built to serve a function at a scale that the small cabin beside it couldn't remotely justify. There was a door at its base barely visible through the vine's iron with a handle that had gone orange with rust. Veda stood in the rain and looked at the tower. She had asked what was inside. She was 7 years old, and she had asked what was inside. She reached into her jacket pocket and closed her fingers around the compass. The brass was cold from the drive. Inside the cabin, she found one functional room, which was the kitchen, and found that generous. Everything else was occupied by mold or animals or the disorder of a structure that had been arguing with the weather for a decade and losing. She spent the first night in her sleeping bag on the kitchen floor, listening to the rain find all the places the roof had given up trying to stop it. She counted 12 separate drip points. She got up at dawn and drove to the nearest town, which was Coldwater, 12 miles north on the county road. Coldwater was a town that had reached a size it intended to remain and had been remaining it since approximately 1970. One diner, one gas station, a post office the size of a generous closet, a pharmacy, a small grocery, and at the end of the commercial block, a hardware store with a hand-lettered sign above the door that read, Teal's Supply, established 1978, and a front window full of the organized density of a store that had been stocking itself for 46 years. She went in. The man behind the counter was perhaps 65, built like someone who had spent 65 years using his body for actual work, with hands that were the index of decades of physical labor, and a face that was neither unfriendly nor immediately welcoming. He was pricing a box of deck screws with a price gun, and he did not stop when she came in. "Help you," he said. She told him about the cabin, the condition of it, what she thought she needed to start. He listened without looking up from the screws. When she finished, he set the price gun down and looked at her for a moment. Druce Place, he said. Yes, you're Clement's granddaughter. Something about the way he said it. Not a question, not a warm recognition. A placement. The way you place someone in a geography you already understood. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a notepad from under the counter and said, "Walk me through what you found." His name was Gantry Teal. He had owned the hardware store for 22 years, having bought it from the man who ran it before him. He had a wife named Nessa, who he mentioned without elaboration, worked part-time at the pharmacy, and knew everyone in Coldwater and had opinions about most of them. He extended her credit, not unlimited, 50% of cost on materials up to $2,000 to be settled when she was able. He didn't explain why. When she asked, he looked at the notepad and said, "I knew your grandfather. He was a fair man." That was all. She drove back to the cabin with the first load in her car. The next 3 months were something she would later have difficulty describing to anyone who hadn't done it, and not because it was beyond description, but because description required a shape to the experience, a narrative arc that went from one state to another, and what those months actually were was more continuous than that. They were a long single day that happened to span a season. She rose at first light every morning because there was no point in not rising. She worked until the light was gone. She ate whatever was cheapest and most caloric and required the least preparation. She lost weight she hadn't known she had to lose and gained muscle in places that had been soft from city living. Her hands changed. She had never particularly thought about her hands before. Now they were different hands. They knew things. The roof was the first necessity. She spent 2 weeks on it, working from a library book on basic roofing she had borrowed from the Coldwater Public Library, watching the relevant videos over the diner's free Wi-Fi on evenings when she needed supplementary instruction. The roofing work required Gantry to lend her equipment she didn't own. He appeared twice during those 2 weeks without being asked, examined what she had done, made 2 corrections without comment, and left. The second time he came, his wife was with him. Nessa Teal was perhaps 60, with the presence of a woman who had spent decades navigating the social geography of a small town and had learned to move through it with complete composure. She arrived carrying a covered pot of something that smelled like the first genuinely good food Veda had encountered in weeks, and she did not explain her presence or ask if it was welcome. She simply set the pot down on the one table in the kitchen that was still functional, found 2 bowls in the cabinet above the sink that she washed before using, and sat down across from Veda. They ate together. Nessa asked about the cabin in the way of someone who was interested in the condition of the building rather than in the story of how Veda came to be there. What was the foundation like? Had she gotten into the basement yet? Was the well tested? She had practical questions, and she asked them practically, and by the end of that first meal, Veda had told her more about the condition of the structure than she had articulated to anyone, including herself. Nessa came back, not every day, but regularly, with or without food. She would appear in the afternoon and sit on whatever surface was available and ask questions, or simply be present while Veda worked, which was its own kind of company. She didn't push, she didn't offer the kind of sympathetic attention that required a response. She was just there the way certain people were just there, without agenda, without the performance of caring. Veda had not had that before. She had not understood how much she needed it until it was there. One afternoon in October, when the work had moved inside and the temperature was dropping with the specific intent of upstate New York autumns, Nessa sat in the kitchen drinking coffee from a thermos she had brought and said, "Have you been out to the tower?" Veda had walked past the tower every day, had stood at the base of it twice and looked up through the vines. had run her hands along the iron door that had a lock she didn't have a key for. "I can't get inside," she said. Nessa turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Gantry says your grandfather came out here twice a year," she said, "right up until the last couple years when he couldn't travel. Always alone. Never said why." "Did Gantry know him well?" Nessa looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "Clement was kind to Gantry when he needed it," she said. "A long time ago. We don't talk about it much." She didn't elaborate and Veda didn't push, but she thought about it. The nights were cold now. The work had moved to the interior room by room stripping what was beyond saving and assessing what wasn't. She had developed a system and a rhythm and an ability to read the building's condition that she hadn't had in August. She knew where the structure was sound and where it was performing. She knew which walls were load-bearing and which were finish walls. She knew the cabin better than she had known any building in her life, including the apartment she had lived in for 5 years. She understood it, and she liked that. She liked the satisfaction of understanding a thing, of being able to look at it and say, "I know what this is doing and why." It was the same satisfaction she had gotten from a clean financial analysis. The same satisfaction as finding the transfer anomaly in January and following it through to certainty. Understanding was not complicated. It was patient. In October, during the second week of the month, she opened the master bedroom. She had been avoiding it. The master bedroom was the room at the rear of the cabin overlooking the lake, the room that had been the worst of it when she arrived. The ceiling had taken significant water damage from a failure in the chimney flashing, and the back wall, the wall that shared a surface with the massive stone fireplace, was soft in ways that walls were not supposed to be soft. She had cataloged it and moved on to other rooms and let it sit. She couldn't let it sit anymore. Winter was coming and the insulation in the back wall needed to be replaced before the temperature made the room uninhabitable, and the room needed to be inhabitable because her options were running out. She put on her respirator and her goggles and she drove a crowbar into the wood paneling to the left of the fireplace. It came off in sections, releasing the smell of damp fiberglass and the older smell beneath it of a wall that had been holding moisture for years. She worked methodically, pulling the paneling, pulling the compromised insulation, bagging it, moving to the next stud bay. It was in the third stud bay that she noticed it. The depth was wrong. She had been working on this cabin long enough to know the depth of its walls by feel. Standard construction, the paneling plus the insulation, plus the stud depth, plus the exterior sheathing. She knew that depth. She knew how far back her flashlight beam should hit something solid. In the third bay, the beam did not hit solid at the expected distance. It went deeper. She tapped the back of the cavity with the metal end of her crowbar. Not the solid thud of exterior logs, not the density of an exterior wall, a thud that had give to it, a thud that was hollow in a way that exterior construction was never hollow. She moved the flashlight and looked more carefully. There was another wall behind the wall, not immediately behind it, not 4 inches back where the exterior should have been. Several feet back in a cavity that should not have existed, a barrier of plywood sealed the back of the stud bay and sealed it with the deliberateness of something that had been built intentionally. She tapped it again. The hollow sound came back to her like an answer to a question. She moved to the next stud bay and stripped it. Same cavity, same depth, same hollow plywood barrier. She moved along the full left side of the fireplace, stripping bay by bay, and in every bay the story was the same. The exterior wall of the cabin did not exist on the left side of the fireplace. Instead, a false wall 3 feet deep had been constructed and disguised behind the paneling, disguised by the mass of the stone chimney beside it, taking up nearly 30 square feet of bedroom space, without any evidence from outside that the room was smaller than it should have been. She stood back and looked at what she'd found. Her grandfather was a meticulous man. She had known him as such. He planned things to the decade. He built things that lasted. He did not waste material or space. He did not build false walls by accident. She picked up the sledgehammer. She drove it through the plywood barrier. The wood splintered and gave, and the sound that came out of the space behind it was a different sound than she had expected. Not the sound of an enclosed space close and dead. A sound with depth to it. A sound that had distance in it. She grabbed her heavy flashlight and shined it through the jagged hole. The air that came out was cold and dry and carried a smell that was specific in a way she couldn't immediately name. Old leather, paper, mothballs, the smell of things that had been sealed for a long time in conditions that were designed to preserve them. She leaned in and shined the light. On the other side of the plywood was a short passage, perhaps 4 feet long, ending in a door. An iron door, set in a stone wall. Not the stone of the fireplace. Different stone, thicker, older, fitted without mortar in a pattern she recognized from the structure she had been walking past every day for 3 months. Granite, the stone of the tower. The cabin was built against the tower. The master bedroom butted up against the tower's base. And behind the false wall, behind the paneling that had been hiding it since before Veda was born, a door opened from the cabin's interior directly into the stone cylinder of the tower. The door was not locked. It was pulled almost closed but not latched. And when Veda pushed it open, it moved on hinges that had been oiled and maintained in a way that nothing else in this cabin had been oiled and maintained. It swung open silently. Beyond it was the base of the tower. The flashlight beam climbed the interior of the cylinder. The stone walls were 10 feet thick at the base and tapered slightly as they rose. The interior diameter was perhaps 15 feet across, and from the stone floor rising in a precise iron spiral that followed the inner curve of the wall was a staircase. It climbed into the dark. She could not see how far. On the stone floor directly in front of the door, something had been placed with care. A framed, simple, dark wood no larger than a sheet of paper under a pane of glass that had been laid flat on the floor and weighted at the corners with 4 small stones. Inside the frame, a piece of paper. She crouched down and shined the light on it. The handwriting was her grandfather's. She knew it immediately, had grown up seeing it on birthday cards and notes slipped into her coat pocket, and the occasional letter that arrived at her apartment in the city, addressed in that particular sharp, deliberate hand. The ink was not fresh, but the paper was dry and uncompromised by the conditions she'd found everywhere else in this property. He had chosen this place specifically because the conditions were right for preservation. She read what he had written. If you are reading this, the compass brought you here. You have broken through what needed to be broken. You have found the door. The stairs above you have 6 floors. Each one has something for you. Go up. She looked at the compass in her pocket. She had carried it for 14 years, not knowing why. She looked up at the iron staircase disappearing into the dark of the tower. Then she put her foot on the first step. The iron held without sound. She began to climb. The first step held. She had not been certain it would. The tower was over 100 years old, and the staircase inside it had been built for industrial purposes, for workers servicing the waterworks equipment that had once occupied this cylinder. And industrial staircases from 1891 were built to a different standard than the staircases she had grown up navigating in Manhattan apartment buildings. But the iron was solid under her boot, not rusted through, not compromised. Someone had maintained this. Someone had come here, regularly, and made sure the stairs held. She climbed. The flashlight beam moved ahead of her up the curve of the staircase, illuminating the stone wall on her left and the open interior of the tower on her right. The cylinder narrowed as it rose, or seemed to the perspective of looking up a circular shaft, creating the impression of contraction even where the actual dimensions held steady. The air was cold, colder than the cabin, colder than outside. The stone held its own temperature, independent of the season, and the temperature it held was the temperature of deep ground, 40 degrees and still and permanent. She counted steps, 19 steps to the first landing. The landing was not a room. It was a widening of the staircase where the iron had been extended outward from the wall to create a platform approximately 6 feet in diameter. In the stone wall beside the platform at chest height, a section of the granite had been cut back and squared, not roughly, with precision. A rectangular niche, perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, cut cleanly into the interior wall and fitted with a wooden shelf that had been sealed against moisture with the treatment she recognized from the library book on wood preservation. On the shelf sat a leather-bound volume. Veda reached for it slowly. The leather was dark and soft with age, but intact, stiff at the spine in the way of books that had been closed for a long time. The brass corner fittings were green with oxidation but structurally sound. There was no title on the cover, nothing embossed or stamped, just the plain dark leather, and on the front in the lower right corner 2 initials burned into the leather. C.D. Clement Druce. She opened it. The handwriting was his, the same sharp, deliberate script from the note on the floor below. But this was not a note. This was a journal. Dated entries, each one beginning with the date in the upper left margin of the page. The first entry was dated March 14, 1992. She read the first page standing on the landing with the flashlight balanced on the stone shelf. The ink had faded to rust, but the words were entirely legible, clear and precise, and written with the care of a man who understood that what he was committing to paper might need to stand as record for longer than he would be alive to explain it. March 14, 1992. I am writing this because there is no one I can speak to about what has been done to me, what my daughter has done. I considered a lawyer, but Virginia has spent 20 years building relationships with every attorney of significance in this city, and I cannot trust that what I tell anyone will not be reported back to her before I have time to act. I am writing this because the act of writing it makes it real in a way that helps me resist the temptation to believe I imagined it. On September 4th, 1991, Virginia came to my office at Druce Holdings at 7 in the evening after the staff had gone. She brought 2 men I did not recognize in a folder. Inside the folder was a collection of documents that purported to show that I had been skimming operating funds into a personal account and misreporting revenue to the IRS. The documents were fabrications. I knew this because I had never done what they described, but they were good fabrications, the kind of fabrications that would require months of forensic accounting to disprove, months that Virginia knew I didn't have. She gave me a choice: sign over my controlling shares and resign my directorship, or she would deliver the folder to the IRS the following morning. I spent 4 hours reading the documents. I spent another hour trying to reach my accountant, who did not answer. I spent a further hour trying to reach my lawyer, who did not answer. At 11 o'clock that evening, with Virginia sitting in my chair watching me, I signed. She took the folder with her. I have not seen my company since. Veda stopped reading. She stood on the iron landing in the dark of the tower and breathed the cold stone air and looked at the words on the page. Her grandfather had built a company from a loan and a business plan and 30 years of work. He had built it the way he built things, carefully and with attention to what would last. And Virginia had walked into his office with a folder of lies and taken it from him in 4 hours. 4 hours. She turned the page. The second entry was dated 3 days later. I have been trying to understand why, not why she wanted the company. That part is simple. Virginia has always wanted the company. What I cannot understand is when she decided that taking it by force was preferable to waiting. She was already in a senior position. She would have inherited a substantial stake. She was patient and intelligent and capable of waiting for what she wanted, unless she wasn't waiting for the company. Unless there was something else, something that required immediate capital at a scale she didn't have access to through legitimate means. I'm going to find out what she needed the money for. Veda turned pages. There were dozens of entries. She did not read them all standing on the landing. She would read them all, but she read enough to understand the structure of what she was holding. Clement had spent the years after 1991 in a methodical investigation of his own. Not angry, not reactive, patient. He had used what resources remained to him after the transfer to build a picture of what Virginia had done with the company in the years that followed. He had documented the decisions she made, the assets she moved, the operations she altered. He had built a case the way a careful person built anything, piece by piece, making sure each piece was accurate before adding the next. And then she found it. The entry was dated January 8th, 1995. I have confirmed what I suspected. The capital Virginia needed in 1991 was not for business purposes. She had been covering Royce's debts since he was a teenager. By 1991, the debt had grown to nearly $2 million owed to 3 separate private lenders, 2 of whom had associations that made the debt not merely a financial problem, but a safety problem. Virginia took my company to manage Royce's situation. That is what I was worth to her. That is the calculation she made. Her father's company against her son's debts. I don't know if I am angrier that she made that calculation or that she could make it and then sit in my chair watching me sign and not show anything in her face. What I did not expect comes next. 3 weeks ago, Royce came to me. He is 16 years old. He sat across from me, and he said he had something to tell me. He said that in the fall of 1995, 4 years after it happened, Virginia laid the transfer documents on the kitchen table in front of him and told him, "This is what I did. This is why. This is how we survive." He was 12 years old when I signed those papers in my office. She waited 4 years to tell him. She waited until she believed he was old enough to hold the secret and young enough to be shaped by it. He came to me because he said he couldn't carry it anymore. I told him I needed time to think about what he had told me. I have had 3 weeks. What I have decided is this. Royce is not a child anymore. He is 16 now, and he came to me of his own choosing and told me the truth. But he has also known for some time and chosen to live inside the protection of it. I cannot call him innocent. I am not willing to call him innocent. But I am also not willing to let the fact of his choice define what I do next, because what I do next is not about Royce. It is about Veda. Veda read the name, her own name, in her grandfather's journal from 1995 when she was 3 years old. She is the one he had written. She is the only one who asks the right questions. I have watched both of them closely. Royce knows how to watch. He knows how to be in a room and observe and stay quiet and accumulate information. But Veda asks. She is 3 years old and she asks. Last month she was at the tower with me and she asked what was inside. Not, I want to go in or can we open it? What is inside? As if the interior of the thing was a question that had an answer and the answer was worth knowing. That is the difference. She closed the journal. She stood on the landing for a long time. Then she put the journal inside her coat, against her chest, the way you carried something irreplaceable, and she climbed to the second floor. The second landing was identical in structure to the first. The same iron platform, the same rectangular niche cut into the stone wall. Inside the niche, protected from moisture by the same sealed wood shelf, and additionally wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied closed with a cord of cotton that was still sound despite its age a bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside the oilcloth stacks of paper, banded, thick bond paper with the printed headers of official financial instruments, the text dense and formal, and printed in the style of the mid-1980s. She held one stack up to the flashlight. U.S. Treasury bearer bonds, issued between 1985 and 1989, each with a face value of $10,000. She counted the stacks without unwrapping them fully. 18 stacks each containing 10 bonds. $1.8 million at face value. She sat with that for a moment. Bearer bonds were not registered instruments. They were owned by whoever held them. They had been discontinued by the federal government in 1982, except for certain categories that continued to be issued through 1989. They were liquid in the way that cash was liquid. Clement had been moving money out of the company before Virginia took it. He had been building a reserve, the kind of reserve you built when you understood that the thing you had built might be taken from you and you needed to ensure that what mattered survived the taking. He had known, not the specifics, not the timeline, but he had known that Virginia was capable of something like what she did, and he had prepared for it years before she did it. She rewrapped the bundle and placed it carefully back in the niche. She would need to think about how to transport these safely. She would need to think about a lot of things. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what was here. She climbed to the third floor. The third landing held a different configuration. Not a book, not a bundle of bonds. Instead, a metal box bolted to the stone wall above the niche, its surface covered in the green patina of old brass. The box had a simple latch, not a lock. She opened it. Inside was a folded document, several pages thick, the paper stiff and yellowed at the edges but intact. She unfolded it under the flashlight. It was a list, typed not handwritten, dated 1989. The heading at the top was in two languages, English in the language of a private bank in Zurich that she recognized by reputation as one of the institutions that had serviced private wealth in Europe and the Americas since the 19th century. Account numbers, 17 of them arranged in a column down the first page, each with an associated account name that was a number rather than a name. Beside each account number, a current balance as of the date of the document. She did the arithmetic as she went down the list. By the time she reached the bottom of the page, she had stopped being surprised by the individual numbers and was simply adding $2.7 million in liquid assets, in accounts that had been opened in 1987 and 1988 and funded before Virginia took the company. Offshore accounts that Virginia had never known about. Accounts that the IRS audit of 1991, which had never actually happened because Clement had signed before it could happen, would never have reached. Her grandfather had known. He had moved the money out in the years before 1991 with the quiet efficiency of a man who was building a contingency plan he hoped he would never need. And when he needed it, the contingency was there. She folded the document and put it in the same inner pocket with the journal. She looked up the staircase. 3 more floors. The 4th floor was the floor that made her stop breathing. Not because of what was in the niche. The niche on the 4th landing contained a velvet bag drawstring closure. The velvet faded from whatever original color it had been to a dusty plum. The bag was soft with age, and inside it, wrapped in chamois cloth, was jewelry. Old jewelry, the kind that was made before jewelry became a fashion industry rather than a craft. The pieces were heavy and real, and the stones in them were the kind of stones that caught even flashlight and turned it into something. Pearls on a double strand with a clasp set in white gold, earrings with diamonds in settings that had been made by hand, a bracelet of platinum and sapphires that she turned in her flashlight beam and watched throw small, cold lights against the stone wall. She knew these pieces. She had seen photographs of them. In the albums her grandmother kept in the photographs on the mantel at the house in Westchester before Virginia sold it in the formal portraits that had been taken every 5 years at a studio in the city. Her grandmother's jewelry collection. The collection that had been stolen in a home burglary in 1993, which Virginia had reported to the insurance company, which had paid out $800,000, which was apparently still here sealed in a velvet bag on a chamois cloth inside a stone tower in upstate New York, because the burglary had been a lie and the collection had never left. She sat down on the iron platform. She sat for a long time. The cold came up through the stone and through the iron and settled into her, the way cold settled into a building when the insulation was gone. She didn't move against it. She just sat. Her grandmother had died in 2002. She had lived the last 9 years of her life knowing that her jewelry was gone, that it had been taken from the home she had shared with Clement for 40 years in a burglary that turned out to be a convenient story Virginia had told an insurance company to generate $800,000. Veda put the velvet bag back in the niche exactly as she had found it. She stood up. She was very careful about being angry right now. Anger was useful in the right quantities and at the right times, and this was not the right time. The right time for anger was not in a dark tower on a cold night when she was alone and no one could see what she was doing with it. The right time was later in a room with more witnesses. She climbed to the 5th floor. The 5th landing held a hinge-top metal box, not unlike the kind used for storing documents in archives, sealed with a simple clasp and padded inside with horsehair batting, dense and effective as an impact absorber and humidity regulator. Inside the batting were 4 items. The first was a microcassette, a small plastic cartridge no larger than her thumb, the kind used in answering machines and pocket recorders in the era before digital audio. It was enclosed in a small Ziploc bag. On the bag, in Clement's handwriting, a single word, September. September 1991. She held it. She would need a player to hear it. She did not have a player. She added it to the list of things she needed. The second item was a contract. 12 pages stapled at the upper left corner, the pages crisp and uncompromised by the sealed conditions. It was titled at the top, Transfer of Controlling Interest, Druce Holdings, LLC, dated September 4th, 1991. She found her grandfather's signature on the last page in blue ink, and beside it, Virginia's, and at the bottom of the page, the notarization. The contract was a standard document. She had seen dozens like it in her 6 years at the company. Except on page 4 in the section defining the representations and warranties that the transferring party was making, someone had added 3 lines in handwriting that was not Clement's and not Virginia's. The additions were initialed in the same handwriting, and the initials small and cramped, and made with a different pen than the one used for the main document. She read the added lines, then she read them again. The additions specified that the transfer was made under duress. Specifically, the phrase was used in handwriting as an addition to a typed document. Transferring party states that this instrument is executed under duress, as defined under applicable law, meaning under threat, coercion, or compulsion that would negate free and voluntary execution. Clement had written it in himself. In the moment of signing, he had added the language that would, if anyone who understood contract law ever looked at this document, render the transfer voidable. She pressed the contract flat against the stone floor and photographed it with her phone. The third item was a manila envelope sealed. The outside was labeled in Clement's writing Royce. Do not open without counsel. She did not open it. She put it back in the batting. The fourth item was a small key. Brass, old, a different key from the compass she carried. This one was smaller and more precise, with a specific cut that suggested it belonged to a mechanism rather than a standard lock. She looked around the fifth-floor landing. There was no lock here for the key to fit, which meant the lock was somewhere else. She looked up. One more floor. The sixth floor was the highest landing, and unlike the others, it was set directly beneath the partially collapsed crown of the tower. The eastern section of the top of the tower had failed at some point in the last several decades, and through the gap in the stone above her, through the broken edge of the tower's crown, she could see sky, the actual sky, open air, the dark blue of a deep autumn night with stars visible where the clouds had broken. She stood on the sixth landing and looked up at the stars through the broken stone of a tower built in 1891, and the strangeness of that moment of being inside something this old and this permanent, and looking at stars through the place where it had broken, was something she held for a few seconds before moving. The niche on the sixth floor was different. It was deeper than the others, set further back into the stone, the opening narrower at the face and widening inside. She had to reach in further to find what was on the shelf. Her hand closed around something, a frame, the same dark wood as the frame on the floor below. She drew it out carefully. Inside the frame, under glass, a photograph. She shined the flashlight on it. It was a photograph of herself, 7 years old, standing in front of the tower, which in the photograph still had its vines, but they were shorter, younger, the tower more visible beneath them. She was looking up, not at the camera, up at the tower. Her face was the face of a child looking at something large and old and trying to understand it. Behind her to the right, partially cut off at the edge of the frame, one hand resting on her shoulder. A hand she knew. Large, square-fingered. The hand of an old man who had spent his life building things. Beside the frame on the same shelf, a key. Brass. Ornate. The key she had been looking for on the fifth floor. And behind the key, pinned to the back wall of the niche with a small iron tack, a letter. She unpinned it. The paper was heavy stock, acid-free, the kind chosen specifically for longevity. The folds were crisp, and the ink was darker than the journal entries written more recently. She unfolded it. Veda. I have wondered for years how to say what I need to say in this letter, and what I keep returning to is that the most useful thing I can do is not explain myself to you, but tell you what you have found. The bonds on the second floor are real and negotiable. They belong to you. The account numbers on the third floor are current accounts. The funds in them have been maintained since 1989 under the management of a trustee I appointed, who has instructions not to release them to anyone who cannot produce the account list, and a specific phrase I gave you once when you were 14 years old. The phrase is, "The compass always knows." You will need to say this to a man named Oscar Fenn at a firm called Meridian Trust in Zurich. He will handle the rest. The jewelry on the fourth floor was my mother's. Virginia told the insurance company it was stolen. It was not stolen. It belongs to you. The contract on the fifth floor was executed under duress and has been authenticated by 2 separate contract law attorneys, neither of whom knows the identity of the other, both of whom have provided written opinions that the duress provision renders the transfer voidable. Those opinions are with my attorney, whose name and contact information are in the manila envelope on the fifth floor. Do not open that envelope until you have your own counsel retained. The key on this floor opens a lockbox on the fifth floor behind the wall panel to the right of the niche. Press the second stone from the left in the second course from the shelf. The panel will move. The lockbox is secured to the wall behind it. Open it. Inside is the final piece, the piece I could not seal in an envelope with everything else, because it is the piece that changes the scale of everything. I knew Virginia would give you this property. I knew it because Virginia does not value what she cannot immediately quantify. She sees a rotting cabin and a dangerous old tower, and she sees a burden. She sees a problem she is solving by relocating it to you. She has never once looked up at this tower and asked what was inside it. Not once in 50 years. You asked when you were 7 years old. You were the only one. I gave you the compass that day because I wanted you to have something that always pointed toward the right direction, even when you couldn't see it. I want you to know that you found the door not because the compass is magic, but because you are the person who kept it for 14 years without knowing why, who trusted that there was a reason even when the reason wasn't visible. That is the thing Virginia cannot buy and cannot fabricate and cannot take from anyone. She took my company. She cannot take the quality that makes you worth giving it to. What is in this tower belongs to you. Rebuild this house. Rebuild yourself. And when you are ready, take back what belongs to us. Your grandfather. Veda read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the stars through the broken crown of the tower and allowed herself 1 full minute of something she had not allowed herself since the elevator ride down 42 floors in September. The minute passed. She pressed the second stone from the left in the second course from the shelf. The panel moved. Behind it, bolted to the stone of the tower wall, was a metal lockbox smaller than she expected. Painted dark green, the paint gone to rust at the edges. She took the brass key from the shelf and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism resisted for a moment, stiff with age. She applied steady pressure the way she had learned to apply steady pressure to old mechanisms, patient and even not forcing. The lock turned. She opened the lid. Inside the box, 3 items. The first was a contract dated March 15th, 2019. It was 62 pages long and it was titled Asset Purchase Agreement, Meridian Commercial Realty, LLC. She turned to the signature page. Virginia Druce, Druce Holdings, LLC. And on the buyer side, Meridian Commercial Realty, LLC, with a registered address in Delaware. She pulled out her phone and searched the Delaware Business Registry. She found Meridian Commercial Realty, LLC. The registered agent was a law firm. The members of the LLC were listed through a series of holding entities, but at the end of the chain, after 4 layers of corporate structure, the ultimate beneficial owner was a trust. The trust had been established in 2018. She searched the trust name. The trust was administered by a law firm in Manhattan. The beneficiary of the trust was listed as a private individual, unnamed. She looked at the purchase price on the first page of the contract. $12 million. For assets that, based on the property descriptions she recognized as real estate holdings, she had worked on valuations for at Druce Holdings. Assets she had assessed at roughly $23 million based on current market. Virginia had sold company assets to an entity she controlled at roughly half their value. She had taken $12 million of company money and paid it to a company she owned, and then not reported the transaction to the board. That was not just theft. That was the kind of transaction that triggered federal investigations. The second item in the lockbox was a stack of bank statements, personal accounts. Virginia's personal accounts, which Veda had no idea how Clement had obtained. The statements ran from 2019 to 2022, and they told the story of the $12 million in very clear terms. It had moved through 3 accounts in about 18 months and eventually landed in accounts registered to the trust. The third item in the lockbox was a single-page, no header, no formal designation, just Clement's handwriting. A note, 4 lines. I obtained the above through channels I am not going to detail here. The provenance of the documents is the concern of lawyers, not of you. What you need to know is that they are authentic. I had them independently verified by 2 forensic accountants who have provided affidavits attesting to their authenticity. The affidavits are with my attorney. This is the thing that finishes it, Veda. Not the cassette tape, not the contract from 1991. Those are the history. This is the present. This is what Virginia has done in the last 5 years that has nothing to do with me and everything to do with what she has done to a company she stole. The board does not know. The shareholders do not know. The SEC does not know. They will. She read the note 3 times. Then she closed the lockbox and locked it and put the key in her pocket and sat on the iron landing with her back against the cold stone of the tower. She held a photograph from the shelf, herself at 7, looking up at the tower, her grandfather's hand on her shoulder. She had never seen this photograph. She had never known it existed. He had been carrying it for 20 years in a tower that no one was allowed to enter, waiting for her to climb the stairs and find it. She did not cry. She had been trained out of it in ways she hadn't fully understood until this moment, trained by a mother who did not cry and did not permit visible weakness and had spent Veda's childhood demonstrating the value of containment. She had absorbed that training. She was good at containment. She knew how to keep things inside where they couldn't be used against her. But she sat on the iron landing with her grandfather's letter in one hand and the photograph of herself in the other, and the stars showing through the broken top of the tower, and the full weight of everything she had climbed through that evening settled on her like stone. She sat with it. She did not put it down. She came down the stairs 45 minutes later. She came through the iron door in the short passage and back into the master bedroom of the cabin, stepping over the debris of the wall she had broken through earlier that evening. She gathered the bonds and the account list and the letter and the lockbox key into the bag she had brought upstairs. She left the microcassette for the moment. She would need to find a player. She walked through the cabin and out the front door. The night air was sharp and cold and smelled of the lake. The sky had cleared and the stars were full across it, the kind of sky that only existed this far from the city. She stood on the front step and breathed it. She took out her phone and called Nessa. It rang twice. Veda. Not hello, just her name, the voice of someone who had been awake. Can you come? Veda said. Her own voice sounded different to her than usual. She noticed this without analyzing it. I'm 20 minutes away, Nessa said. Put the kettle on. She sat on the step and looked at the tower. From outside at night, the tower was a black shape against a dark sky, the outline of it visible only where it blocked the stars. You had to know it was there to see it. You had to be looking for it. Her grandfather was right. Virginia had never looked. The sound of tires on gravel reached her from the road. Nessa's headlights swept the tree line as the car came down the drive. The car stopped and Nessa got out, not hurrying, moving with her characteristic steadiness. She sat down on the step beside Veda. She did not say anything. She looked at the lake and the tower and she sat. Veda reached into the bag and took out the photograph, the one from the 6th floor, herself at 7 looking up. She set it on the step between them. Nessa looked at it. She did not say anything for a long time. He kept this up there, Nessa said. Sixth floor. Veda paused. In a frame, under glass. Nessa's hands folded in her lap, the gesture of women who had learned to hold things still. Veda said, he planned everything. For decades. He left me everything inside that tower, and he arranged it so that Virginia would be the one to send me here. She paused. He knew she would. He knew she would give me something she thought was worthless. Yes, Nessa said. They sat. And then because Nessa was there, and the stars were visible and the tower was standing in the dark, and because she had not in 3 months and she could not hold it in any longer, Veda began to cry. Not quietly, not the control kind, the kind that came from a place below the training, below the containment, from wherever the things you had kept inside long enough finally went when they had run out of room. Nessa did not say anything. She did not try to slow it or contain it or redirect it or make it smaller than it was. She put one hand on Veda's shoulder, warm and real and steady, and she sat there while Veda cried. When it was over, Veda wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat. They sat for a while after in the quiet that followed what had just happened. Then Nessa said, Gantry needs to tell you something. About what? About your grandfather. She paused. About me. Veda looked at her. Not tonight, Nessa said. In the morning, when you've slept. She stood. I'm going to make the tea. You're going to sit here for 5 more minutes. Then you're going to come inside and drink it, and then you're going to sleep. She went inside. Veda sat on the step for 5 minutes exactly. She looked at the tower. She thought about Clement, about what it took to build something like what he had built inside that tower. Not just the physical act of installing shelves and sealing niches and maintaining a staircase. The patience of it, the span of it. Building something over decades with the understanding that the person who needed it hadn't been born yet when he started. Sealing evidence and liquidity and instruments of justice into a granite cylinder in upstate New York, and then visiting it twice a year to maintain it, to keep the stairs sound and the shelves dry and the iron door hinges oiled for 30 years. 30 years of patient preparation for a granddaughter he trusted because she was 7 years old and she had looked up. She stood up. She went inside. Nessa had found the tea she had bought in Coldwater weeks ago and had located the kettle and the 2 intact mugs and had cleaned both of them with a thoroughness that suggested she found their condition before cleaning not quite acceptable. The cabin smelled briefly like something normal, something domestic. Veda sat at the kitchen table. Nessa set a mug in front of her. In the morning, Veda said. In the morning, Nessa agreed. She sat across the table. They drank their tea in the quiet of 2 people who had run through something together and had arrived on the other side of it in the same place. Outside the tower stood in the cold and the dark, emptied now of what it had been, holding its 6 floors bare of everything Clement had placed in them and brought here twice a year for 30 years. It was still standing. It was granite. It intended to keep standing. Gantry came in the morning. Veda had slept, which surprised her, 4 hours of the kind of sleep that happened when the body decided it was done, regardless of what the mind intended. She woke to the sound of Gantry's truck on the gravel and the smell of coffee that Nessa had started before she left at midnight, left in a thermos on the counter with a note that said, Gantry will come at 7. Don't eat before he gets there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the thermos when he knocked. He came in without ceremony, set a paper bag from the diner on the table, poured himself coffee from his own thermos, and sat across from her. He looked at her face the way he had been looking at her face for 3 months, assessing the condition of the structure rather than the surface appearance of it. Nessa tells me you found the tower, he said. Last night. He nodded, not surprised. The nod of someone confirming information he had been expecting to arrive for a while. She tells me you found the letter. Yes. He wrapped both hands around his thermos cup and looked at it for a moment. He was not a man who had difficulty with silence. He had demonstrated this over 3 months of working beside her. But this silence was different from the working silences. This one had something in it that he was deciding how to carry through words. Clement told me something, Gantry said. A long time ago, 22 years ago. He told me he was going to tell me once, and then he wasn't going to mention it again, and he wanted me to do the same. He stopped. Nessa had cancer, he said. 2002. Breast cancer. Second stage. The treatment was good, and we caught it early enough, but the treatment was not cheap, and we had insurance, but not enough insurance, and the gap between what the insurance paid and what the treatment cost was significant. He paused. A man called me in January of 2003, said he was calling from a charitable medical assistance foundation I had never heard of. Said the foundation had reviewed our case and was offering to cover the outstanding medical debt in full. Anonymous donor, no strings, no contact. No, he stopped again. We took it, he said. We weren't in a position to be proud about it. We took it and we paid the hospital and we never found out who the donor was. He looked up from his coffee. Clement called me the following spring. He came up here like he did twice a year. We had coffee. He said, I heard Nessa is doing well. I said she was. He said, when someone comes to that property who needs help, I want you to be in a position to help them. I said I would. That was all he said about it. Veda looked at him across the table. He never told you it was him, she said. Not in words. He didn't need to. I'm not a man who misses much. They sat with that. He planned this for decades, Veda said. Yes. He made sure you would be here, made sure you would help me before I was old enough to need it. He planned things at a scale most people don't, Gantry said. He told me once you don't build something to last 5 years. You build it to last 50, and then you don't think about the 5 again. He picked up his thermos cup. I think the same is true of what he left for you. Veda looked at the table. She thought about Clement, about the scope of what he had done. Not just the evidence, not just the money, the human infrastructure of it, the invisible network he had built around the person he trusted, ensuring that when she arrived in this place, she would not be alone. Gantry's credit extended without explanation. Nessa appearing without invitation. A town that had been prepared for her without knowing it was being prepared. Decades of patience, all of it quiet, all of it invisible from the outside, all of it pointing in one direction. What do I need to do, she asked. Gantry set down his cup. First, he said, eat something, then we talk about what comes next. She ate, then they talked. The conversation that morning on the kitchen table of a cabin that was still half stripped and smelled of wood treatment and fresh plaster was the conversation that changed the shape of everything. Not because Gantry told her things she didn't know. He didn't. He mostly confirmed what she already understood, which was that what she had found in the tower was real and specific and sufficiently documented to be dangerous. He confirmed it in the way that a man who had built things all his life confirmed the structural integrity of something someone else had built, methodically, testing each element. By the end of 2 hours, she had a plan. Not the full plan, the first layer of it, the layer that was secure what you have, understand what you need, identify the person who can help you use it. She spent the next week doing all three. Securing the bonds required a trip to a safety deposit facility in Rochester, 2 hours away, large enough and corporate enough that a young woman depositing a considerable amount of negotiable financial instruments attracted no more attention than any other unusual transaction that passed through a city-sized vault facility on any given day. She took only what she needed to establish the account and left the rest in the tower in the interim. She came back the following week with the remainder. Understanding what she had required 3 evenings with a yellow legal pad, and the documents spread across the kitchen table working through the legal architecture of each piece. She had spent 6 years at Drew's Holdings. She understood corporate structure, and she understood securities law, and she understood audit procedure. She did not understand every element of what she was looking at, but she understood enough to map it. The 1991 contract in its duress language, the cassette tape and what it would mean if authenticated, the 2019 asset purchase agreement and the SEC implications, the jewelry and the insurance fraud. Each piece was real. Each piece was documented. Each piece was part of a larger structure that only became fully visible when you could see all of them at once. She had the full picture. The person she needed was a corporate litigator, not just any litigator, the specific kind who had operated at the level of national significance, who had handled cases involving federal regulatory bodies, who had a record that established credibility with both the SEC and the DOJ, and who had no existing relationships with Drew's Holdings or anyone connected to it. She spent 3 days asking people who would know to point her toward that person. Not publicly, not through channels that could be monitored. Through individuals she trusted, reaching out one at a time, describing the general parameters of the situation without specifics, asking for names. The name Beckett Fain came back to her from 3 separate sources independently, which was the kind of convergence she had learned to pay attention to. She called his office and got his assistant and explained the nature of the matter in general terms and was told Mr. Fain would be available in 3 weeks. She said 3 weeks was fine. In the interim, the work continued. The cabin work, which was its own necessity entirely separate from the legal work, but which ran parallel to it in a way that she found grounding. The two things together, the physical construction and the legal construction, gave her days a structure that had nothing optional in it. There was always something that needed doing. There was always a next step that was clear. She had spent her adult life in an environment that rewarded the kind of person who could see clearly and work precisely and hold complexity without reducing it. That environment had also been trying to eliminate her for the last year. But the skills it had demanded of her were the same skills that were keeping her functional now, and there was something clarifying about that. About understanding that what you were good at was what you were good at, regardless of whether the people who had trained you deserved to have trained you. Gantry became the general contractor for the cabin renovation in the formal sense. As the weeks progressed, and the scope of what remained expanded beyond what Veda could accomplish alone. He brought in 2 men from Coldwater he trusted, neither of whom asked questions about why a young woman from the city was restoring a lake property in November, both of whom worked at the standard that Gantry expected. The work that Veda did alongside them was different from the work she had done alone in the first 3 months. More skilled, more deliberate. She was not learning anymore, not in the urgent, improvised way of someone doing something for the first time under conditions that required it to go right. She was practicing now the way you practiced a thing once you understood its principles. She knew the cabin. She knew what it needed. She did the work from that knowledge, and it was different from doing it without it. Nessa managed the interior with opinions that were specific and communicated without apology. She and Veda disagreed about the kitchen layout twice, reached a compromise both times, and ended up with something better than either of them had originally proposed. This was Veda came to understand how Nessa operated. She had strong views and she held them openly, and she was also genuinely interested in arriving at the best outcome. And these two things together meant that disagreeing with her was productive rather than combative. On a clear morning in December, standing on the restored front porch looking at the lake, Veda did a quiet inventory. The cabin was not finished. It would not be finished for another several months. But it was livable, properly livable in a way it had not been when she arrived. The roof was sound. The walls were insulated. The floors were clean and refinished. The fireplace worked. The kitchen had running water and functional appliances. The windows were intact. It was a house, not her mother's kind of house, not the kind that signaled wealth through deliberate excess, but a house in the true functional sense of the word. A structure that protected the people inside it from the conditions outside. She turned and looked at the tower. She had cleared the vines from the lower 20 feet. The granite of the base was visible now, gray and solid, the same stone as the foundation. The door had been restored with new iron hardware that matched the original profile. The stairs inside had been cleaned and inspected by gantry and confirmed sound. She had not converted the tower into anything. She had preserved it, left the 6 landings exactly as they were, minus what she had removed. It was a record. That was what it was. A record of what a man had built and what had been done to it and what he had done in return. She left it intact because intact was what it deserved to be. In January, 5 months after the night, she found the door. She drove to New York City. The office of Beckett Fane was on the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue that had been built in the 1950s by people who understood that permanence was a form of communication. The lobby had marble floors and high ceilings and the specific hush of a space that had been designed to prepare people for something serious. Fane was a small man with a large presence, which was a combination she had rarely encountered before. He was perhaps 55 slight, with the stillness of someone who had learned that most communication happened before the words. He shook her hand and looked at her for 3 seconds, and then sat across from her and said, "You have something large." "Yes," she said. "Walk me through it." She walked him through it for 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, he asked her 6 questions, each one targeting a specific potential weakness in the case. She answered all 6. The answers did not require hedging. He said the 2019 contract is the center of it. The 1991 material is the context. The insurance fraud is the character evidence. The center is the 2019 contract. If we can authenticate it independently, you have something that the SEC and the DOJ both want. My grandfather had it independently verified by forensic accountants. I want my own verification. 2 firms independent of each other, standard chain of custody. Yes. The microcassette tape. I found a player in February. The recording is what my grandfather described. Virginia and Clement. September 4th, 1991. Virginia's voice is clear and unambiguous. Fane was quiet for a moment. That tape, if authenticated, is worth more than the rest of it combined, he said. Not legally. Legally, the 2019 contract is the larger issue. But in terms of what a jury understands, hearing a woman tell her father to sign or she'll destroy him is not abstract. I understand. How do you want this to end? He asked. She had thought about this. She had thought about it for months in the cabin in the evenings after Gantry and his crew had gone, in the early mornings before they arrived, standing at the kitchen window with the lake visible through the new glass. I want the company back, she said. Druce Holdings was built by my grandfather. It was taken by my mother. I want it returned to the control of the person my grandfather would have chosen. Which is you. Which is me. Fane nodded. He did not say it would be difficult. He did not say it would be easy. He said, I'll need 6 months to build this correctly. I have time, she said. She drove back to the lake that evening. The 6 months Fane needed were not passive months. She used them. She spent them learning the current state of Druce Holdings through the network she had built during 6 years at the company, through the financial disclosures that publicly traded companies were required to make, through the conversations she had with former colleagues who remembered her and who in a handful of cases were not entirely comfortable with what they were seeing happen inside the company since she had left. What was happening inside the company was what she had told Virginia would happen. 14 months after she had laid the bank records out on the glass table and told her mother that the IRS would be interested, the IRS had become interested. Not because Veda had filed anything, because the audit that had always been a matter of time had become a matter of now. The shell companies she had documented were not the only shell companies. They were the visible ones. The IRS found the others. And Fane, working through channels she was not entirely privy to, ensured that the SEC began looking at the 2019 contract before the audit was complete. She did not know the exact sequence of events inside the company during those months. She knew the outcomes. The board had voted no confidence in Virginia's leadership in April. The banks had frozen the primary credit line in May after the SEC sent its first inquiry letter. Royce had stopped returning board calls by June. By the time Veda was ready, Druce Holdings was a company standing in a room it had been told was on fire, unable to find the door. On a Tuesday morning in August, 14 months after the boardroom meeting in September, Veda drove from Coldwater to Manhattan. She had done this before. She had done it in September of the previous year with $420 and a severance envelope and the hollow quality of a person who has been told they do not exist. She was doing it now in a car that had been serviced recently, wearing a suit that she had had made in March by a tailor in Rockland County who had taken 2 fittings and listened carefully. She had the compass in her jacket pocket, as she always did. The drive took 4 hours. At 7 in the morning, in the parking structure of the building on 42nd Street that contained the offices of Druce Holdings, she sat in her car for 10 minutes. She was not afraid. She was locating herself. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Fear in the act of locating yourself before something significant felt similar from the outside. They were not the same thing. Fear was about what might happen. Locating yourself was about knowing precisely where you were standing before you took the next step. She knew exactly where she was standing. She got out of the car. She took the elevator to the lobby, not to the 42nd floor, to the lobby where she met Beckett Fane, who was already there, his briefcase at his side, his face its customary mask of professional calm. He looked at her. He did not ask how she was. He said the acquisition closed at 9 this morning. The building's management company has been notified. We have the documentation. She nodded. They took the elevator to the 42nd floor together. The boardroom of Druce Holdings occupied the same space it had always occupied. The same glass table, the same view, the same quality of light in the morning coming from the east, hitting the table surface and throwing it up against the opposite wall in long bright bars. Virginia was already there. She was sitting at the head of the table as she always sat. Charcoal suit, silver hair, hands folded. The posture of a woman maintaining a position through the discipline of appearance when the position itself had become uncertain. To her right, Royce, who was 45 now and looked older. The suit was the same quality, but it fit differently than it had 14 months ago. The way clothing fit differently on a person who had been under sustained pressure for a long time. He looked at the table when Veda came in. Virginia's legal counsel sat along the wall, two of them, not the usual three. The room had the quality of a space that knew something was about to happen and had arranged itself accordingly. Virginia looked at Veda when she came through the doors. She looked at Fane. She looked at the briefcase. Something moved behind her eyes. A calculation like always, rapid and complete. Security, she said to the room in general with the even tone of someone stating a procedure rather than expressing alarm. Please escort these individuals from the building. I wouldn't do that, Veda said. Her voice came out the way she had intended it to come out. Even, not raised. The voice of someone who was not making a request. She walked toward the table. Security responds to building management, she said. Building management responds to the entity that holds the debt on this property. At 9 this morning, through a proxy holding company, I acquired the majority debt position on this building. She reached the table. She did not sit. She stood at the opposite end of the glass surface from where she had stood 14 months ago at the head of it. If anyone is being escorted from this building, it will be you. Virginia's hands folded on the table did not move. That was the measure of her. That even now, with the calculation completed and the result returned, she kept her hands still. That is not possible, Virginia said. The transaction documents are available for your review. You had $420, Virginia said. Her voice had the flatness of disbelief encountering fact. You had nothing. You had a condemned cabin in the middle of nowhere. I had Grandpa Clement's cabin, Veda said, and his tower. Fane set his briefcase on the table. He unclasped it and removed a bound document and placed it on the glass surface. Then another, then a third, each one placed with deliberate precision, the sound of each landing carrying in the silent room. Virginia did not look at the documents. She looked at Veda. Whatever you think you found, Virginia said, it won't hold up. The cassette tape from September 4th, 1991 has been authenticated by two independent audio forensic firms. Fane said his voice the conversational tone he used in boardrooms, which was more menacing than most people's raised voices. We have provided a courtesy redacted copy to the FBI's white-collar division. They are pursuing their own authentication separately. The 2019 asset purchase contract has been authenticated by two separate forensic accounting firms, both of whom have submitted affidavits. The SEC has been in receipt of a full briefing package since May. They have found it highly informative. He adjusted the placement of the third document by a quarter-inch. The insurance claim filed in 1993 regarding the loss of Margaret Druce's jewelry collection represents a separate matter which the relevant insurance company, who is still in business and whose fraud investigation unit is highly active, has been notified of. Virginia looked at Royce. The same communication that had passed between them 14 months ago in this room passed again. The quick exchange, the instant completion. But this time the result of the exchange was different. This time it did not have the quality of a decision already made. It had the quality of two people arriving at the end of their options. Royce looked at the table. Veda reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She took out the photograph. The one from the 6th floor of the tower. Herself at 7 years old standing in front of the tower looking up. Clement's hand on her shoulder. She set it on the table, not in front of herself, in the center of the table where both Virginia and Royce could see it. She waited. Virginia looked at the photograph, at her daughter at 7 years old. at her father's hand. Something happened in Virginia's face that Veda had never seen there before. Not remorse, not anything as straightforward as remorse. Something more structural than that. The look of a person who has built a version of reality over decades and is watching it fail the load test. He never told you about the tower, Veda said. In 50 years, you never asked him what was inside it. You came up here once a year at Christmas, and you drove past that tower, and you never once asked what was inside. She looked at her mother across the length of the table. He built everything you see in those documents inside that tower. He maintained it for 30 years. He visited it twice a year. He was at the tower the month before he died, and he was 81 years old, and he climbed 6 floors of iron stairs to make sure what he had left there was still intact. The room was very quiet. He knew you would give me the property, Veda said. He knew because he understood how you made decisions. He knew you would see a rotting cabin and an old tower, and you would see a burden. He knew your arrogance would not allow you to look at something that didn't immediately show its value. She paused. He used the same quality that allowed you to take his company against you. He built the weapon in the place your arrogance guaranteed you would never look. Royce's jaw worked. He looked at the photograph. He looked at it the way a person looked at an image of themselves at a moment of irreversibility, a moment before which the world was one thing and after which it was another. "Mom," he said. His voice had the hollow quality of a man arriving somewhere he had been walking toward for a long time. Virginia did not look at him. She looked at the documents. At the document on the left, which was the cassette tape authentication report, she looked for a long moment. Then she looked at the center document, which was the SEC briefing summary. Then she looked at the right document, which was the 2019 asset purchase agreement with Fain's analysis appended. She read the 2019 document more carefully than the others. Fain letter. He understood the weight of documentation. He understood that what he was watching was a person coming to terms with the mathematics of his situation through the only language they trusted, which was the language of legal instruments. Virginia set the document down. "What do you want?" she said. "The same thing my grandfather wanted," Veda said. "His company back." Fain reached back into the briefcase and produced 2 additional documents. He placed them on the table, one in front of Virginia and one in front of Royce. Both documents were thick and stapled and formatted in the dense way of binding legal agreements. Document A, Fain said, is a full and irrevocable relinquishment of all shares in Druce Holdings held by Virginia Druce, transferring controlling interest to Veda Druce in a transaction that will be registered with the SEC within 48 hours of execution. Document B is a sworn and notarized statement detailing Virginia's personal knowledge of and involvement in the transactions documented in the 2019 asset purchase agreement suitable for submission to the SEC and the DOJ. He clasped his briefcase. "If both documents are signed today," he continued, "Ms. Druce's counsel has agreed to refrain from providing the 1993 insurance fraud documentation to the insurance company's fraud unit. The IRS matter regarding Royce Druce's tax liabilities will proceed on its own timeline, as it is no longer within our client's scope to effect. You will be financially diminished. You will be permanently excluded from corporate directorship in any regulated industry. But you will not be managing criminal exposure on the insurance fraud in addition to everything else." He straightened his jacket. "If both documents are not signed today, the insurance fraud documentation goes to the relevant party this afternoon." Virginia looked at Royce again. This time there was no communication. Royce looked at Veda. He looked at his sister. Across 17 years of age difference and 14 months of a contest that had gone one direction only, He looked at her the way a man looked at someone he had failed in a way that was too large and too long to address inside any available conversation. I was 16, he said. I know, she said. She laid the documents on the table and told me it was done. She told me there was no going back. I know. I should have, Royce. She said his name quietly, not gently, clearly. The documents need to be signed. His jaw worked. He looked at his document. He picked up the pen that Fane had placed beside it. He signed. Virginia watched her son sign. Then she picked up her own pen. She did not look at Veda when she signed. She looked at the glass table, at the reflection of the room and the surface of it, at the bright bars of morning light that came through the eastern windows and fell across the polished glass, and threw the image of the room back at itself in a softer version. She signed twice. Both documents. Fane collected the documents with the composed efficiency of someone who had concluded a great many proceedings and understood that the way you handled the conclusion was as important as how you handled the middle. Virginia set her pen down. She sat. She did not look at anything in particular. Not at Veda, not at Royce, not at the window or the table or the room she had occupied for 3 decades. She sat with the stillness of a person who has just done the last thing they had to do. Veda picked up the photograph from the center of the table. She looked at it, herself at 7, looking up, Clement's hand on her shoulder, the tower behind her green with younger vines. She put the photograph back in her jacket pocket. She looked at Royce one more time. He was still looking at the table. The pen was on the glass in front of him, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man trying to understand the weight of what he had just set down. She had nothing more to say to him today. There would be other conversations, later. Whether she chose to have them or not was a decision she was not making today. Today she was making one decision only, and she had made it. She turned. She walked to the door. She did not look back at the room. The elevator ride down took 42 seconds. She counted them again. Fane walked beside her through the lobby and out into the August heat of the city. He shook her hand on the sidewalk, said he would be in touch within the week, and walked in the direction of wherever Beckett Fane went when he was done winning. She stood on the sidewalk. The city was the city. The noise of it, the scale of it, the energy of a place that had never once in its history paused to consider whether its pace was appropriate for the people moving through it. She had grown up in this. She had known no other geography until 14 months ago, when she had stood in rain in front of a ruined cabin in upstate New York and understood for the first time that geography was not neutral. She had a 4-hour drive back to the lake. She started walking toward the parking structure. The drive out of the city took longer than the drive in. August traffic. She did not mind. She had music she liked and a thermos of coffee from the gas station that was worse than anything Nessa made and better than anything she had drunk in the apartment in the last weeks of that other life. The landscape changed the way it always changed on that drive. The city asserting itself for longer than you expected, the density of it refusing to break until suddenly it did the transition to the outer suburbs, and then to the smaller towns, and then to the country that had no intention of being called anything other than what it was. She crossed the Coldwater County line at 4 in the afternoon. She stopped at Teal's Supply. Gantry was behind the counter pricing hardware, as he often was in the afternoons when the morning customers had cleared and the evening rush had not started. He looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he read everything, taking inventory before speaking. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He nodded, the same nod he gave when he looked at a piece of work that had come out right. Not enthusiastic, just accurate. "Nessa's at the property," he said. "She'll want to hear it." I know. She drove the last 12 miles on the county road with the windows down. The late afternoon light was doing what late afternoon light in August did in upstate New York, going gold, in the way that made this landscape the thing it was, the thing that made people who left it remember it as more beautiful than they expected. She turned down the gravel road. The cabin came into view around the bend. She stopped the car. She had stopped in this same place in October of the previous year in the rain and looked at a structure that was collapsing under the weight of its own neglect. The memory of that view and the view in front of her now occupied the same physical space, and she felt both of them at the same time, which was its own kind of vertigo. The cabin stood. Not just stood, held. The restored cedar siding was still pale from the supplier, not yet weathered to the color the original had been. But the profile of it was right. The proportions were right. The way it sat against the hillside, and the lake was right in the way that something was right when it had been built by someone who understood the land it was sitting on. And behind the cabin to the left, the tower. She had cleared the vines from the lower 20 feet. The granite of the base showed now gray and solid, completely indifferent to everything that had happened around it in 130 years. The upper sections still wore their vines, the old growth of it that had been there longer than she had been alive, and she had left that. It belonged. From the road you could see the tower now. You could see it was real and old and specific. You could see it was not a ruin. It was a structure that had been built to last and had lasted, and the evidence of its lasting was in the quality of the stone and the way it stood without apology. She pulled the rest of the way down the drive. Nessa was on the front step, two mugs on the step beside her. She looked up when she heard the car, and she read Veda's face the way she had been reading it since October, with the patient accuracy of a woman who did not miss much. She moved one mug to Veda's side of the step. Veda parked the car. She got out. She walked to the step and sat down beside Nessa. She picked up the mug. The coffee was from the thermos Nessa always brought, which was always better than anything else in a 40-mile radius. The lake was in front of them, flat and dark and silver in the late light, the surface of it doing what calm water did in the hour before sunset, holding the sky above it and giving it back in a version that was more still than the original. They sat. The August evening settled around them in increments, the way evenings settled in places that were not in a hurry. The light changed, the water changed with it. The tower threw a long shadow east across the lawn, and the shadow moved slowly as the sun moved, the way shadows moved on summer evenings when you had the time to watch. Nessa did not ask how it had gone. She did not need to. She had been reading the available information since Veda got out of the car, and she had reached her conclusion and set it aside in the way she set aside things that were confirmed. Gantry says he can start on the boathouse in September, Nessa said. I know, he mentioned it last week. It needs the foundation poured before the frost comes. October at the latest. October is risky up here. I know, September. Nessa drank her coffee. The shadow of the tower had reached the edge of the lawn, now the tip of it just touching the water. Veda reached into her jacket pocket. She took out the compass. She set it on her palm. The brass was warm from her body heat. The needle trembled for a moment in the way it always did, the small uncertainty of something settling, and then it stopped. It pointed as it always pointed in one direction. She closed her fingers around it. She had carried this for 14 years. She would carry it for whatever came after. Not because it showed her anything she didn't already know, because he had given it to her when she was 14, and she had kept it without knowing why, and the keeping of it turned out to be the thing. The tower stood behind her. 65 feet of granite. 130 years of being exactly what it was. a structure that had been built for a function that no longer existed and had been given a different function by a man who understood that things built to last could be repurposed without losing what made them last. The vines on the upper sections caught the evening light, now the green of them going gold, the whole upper portion of the tower glowing briefly with the borrowed light of a sun that was finishing. The light held for a moment, then it released. The lake went from silver to pewter. The tower went from gold back to gray. Everything settled into the quality of the evening just before dark, when everything was exactly what it was without the flattery of direct light. Nessa finished her coffee. She did not move to leave. She set her empty mug on the step beside her and looked at the water. "Your grandfather used to sit here," she said. "When he came to check on the place, he would sit on the step and look at the water, and he never said what he was thinking." "Did you ever ask once? What did he say?" Nessa was quiet for a moment. "He said, 'I'm thinking about what's already been done and whether it was enough.'" Veda looked at the lake. She thought about what had already been done, about the 6 floors of a tower and 30 years of twice-yearly maintenance, and a compass given to a 14-year-old girl without explanation, and a hardware store owner and his wife positioned in a small town in upstate New York a decade and a half before they would be needed. She thought about a cassette tape sealed in a Ziploc bag on a horsehair shelf in 1992, about bearer bonds wrapped in oilcloth, about a journal that had been waiting in the dark to be read, about a photograph of a 7-year-old girl looking up. It was enough, she said. The evening settled fully. The lake held the last of the light in its surface, a pale silver persistence at the horizon, where the sky was still giving something up. The tower stood. The cabin stood behind them, warm and lit from inside the new windows, throwing their light out across the lawn. She had one hand on the compass. She sat on the step of the house her grandfather had built for her, and she watched the lake and she breathed the air of a place that had been prepared for her by someone who loved her at a scale, and with a patience she was only beginning to understand. The compass needle was still. It had found its direction. So had she.